Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the Yale SOM Exchange. My name is Tristan Botello, and I'm an assistant professor here at SOM. Today, we have a discussion on launching your startup after graduation, and I'm joined by three fantastic SOM alums: Dennis, founder of Ocho Candy; John, co-founder of Holderness and Bourne; and Rochelle, CEO and founder of Big Orange Splot. As someone who does research and teaches an introductory course here for the MBAs and EMBAs, I'm excited to be here to moderate this discussion. Because a common question I receive from students is, what is it like to launch a venture after graduation? From a practical perspective, much of what you do for your venture is going to be the same, regardless if you're in college, if you're a graduate student, or if you're working. But a lot of the questions that I receive have more to do with the transition, such as, what is the transition like? When will I know it's time to go for it? And how do you deal with the stakes being higher? You know, maybe some people have been working for a decade, built up this career, and they feel like they have more to lose. So for that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. And I'm going to introduce some kind of orienting questions we have. And while we're chatting today, you'll see a Q&A tab somewhere on your screen that you can submit questions for the panelists or for me to answer. So please do that at any time. And later on in the discussion, we'll have a dedicated time slot for Q&A. So for the panelists, can you start by telling us your class year, what you did before coming to SOM, what you did upon graduating, and then get into your venture? Give us a description of what it is, how you found that opportunity, and specifically what your transition was like going from being an employee at an established company after graduating from SOM to becoming a founder. So we're going to kick it off in alphabetical order with Dennis. So if you could start us off, that'd be great.
Hi, my name's Dennis Ring, and I'm the founder of a company called Ocho Candy. Prior to starting it, and I graduated from SOM in 1984. Prior to that, I had done a master's in philosophy at Fordham. A few years after graduation, I found myself in the food industry and was very attracted to organic and natural foods. Ended up working at Whole Foods. And the genesis of Ocho started with an awareness that whenever there was a organic version of a mainstream iconic brand, it usually did very well. And I started thinking about that for several years, and then ultimately in 2010 started the company.
Great. So could you tell us a little more about, that transition, what it was like for you? How long were you thinking about that idea before you ended up, founding it on your own? If there was any event that kind of led you over the edge to do that, and anything about the transition itself that you kind of like to highlight for our guests today?
The transition came as a result. I created the 365 product line for Whole Foods starting in '97. And what I noticed was every time there was an organic version of a really good product, for example, Stephen Barry's Honest Tea, or even Annie's mac and cheese, the organic mac and cheese, it became very, very popular in the marketplace. I kept seeing this over and over and over again, the entire dairy set, even cookies and crackers. I fully expected somebody to do an organic Snickers bar or an organic version of some other kind of confection. It didn't happen. And it wasn't until after I left Whole Foods that I actually put together the structure and the branding architecture for Ocho and started making it happen. For me, the desire was the joy of working in organic food, and also the awareness that there was a big hole in the marketplace when it came to organic confections.
Great. Now turn it over to John. If you could kind of give us a similar rundown, that'd be great.
Sure. My name's John Bourne, and I graduated SOM in 2010. Prior to SOM, I did a bunch of different things, and I did a couple things afterwards as well before founding Holderness and Bourne. I was a graphic designer and video editor at a couple different big media companies in New York City. Went to SOM with the idea of transitioning from the creative side of that industry into the management side of media. Interned at the Associated Press and sort of was on that track when I was lured by an offer to join a private equity firm, which I did. So total 180 from what I was doing before. I didn't know Excel when I went to SOM. You know, I had never really worked in spreadsheets or frankly, you know, been responsible on a day-to-day, keeping really in touch on email. I mean, it was a joke. So a big transition for me through SOM. And then afterwards, I worked for a couple of years at this private equity firm, was not enjoying that. Did a digital strategy role at a media publishing company, so sort of back into media. And through all that, realized that I had sort of an interest in being closer to a product, to an end kind of tangible output. And I also recognized that I had a closing window in terms of my life responsibilities to start a company, or it felt to me at that time like, you know, marriage and kids and the other things that were on the forecast would be prohibitive to starting a company. So recognizing that, and then really probably the most important thing was meeting my co-founder, who I met at business school. We, you know, stayed in touch after business school, and it was about 4 years after business school that we launched our brand. We launched the brand out of a shared kind of passion for menswear on a hobby level. We were both the guys that when you needed a new suit or you needed a new pair of pants or whatever, you came to us and said, hey, what's cool? Hey, should I wear a peak lapel tuxedo or a roll collar tuxedo? And, you know, what's proper? You know, what time can you start wearing tuxedos? Things like that. So we had a hobby level passion for menswear and a real point of view on kind of style. And then golf was the other piece of it. So Holmerson Board is a really golf-focused apparel brand. And we played a lot of golf together and kind of, you know, you'll hear this always. There's always a perceived void in the marketplace. But we thought there was a gap between very classic brands that were doing nice styling, but really poor fits for guys who were looking for something a little bit tailored, a little bit cleaned up. And then some of the more either big box or modern brands, you know, maybe they're doing better things on fit, but the style was garish, logos were huge. You looked like you were racing the Tour de France and you're just trying to go out and play a nice round of golf. So not curing cancer by any means, but it was a little niche, a little sort of gap market that we perceived, and it dovetailed nicely with our kind of love of menswear and our love of golf. So we threw ourselves into that kind of nights and weekends while working our regular day jobs for about a year, probably 2013 to 14. And then 2014, formed the company, put our first collection into the market, and we've been growing just sort of one foot in front of the other since then. At this point, Holmerson Bourne has, you know, about 12 employees, you know, on track to have a good year revenue-wise. We'll turn the corner towards profitability, and we're in about 300 golf shops across the country and across the world. So we've got a real brand on our hands. But in 2014, we had honestly no inkling of what we were doing or how we were going to get there. And, you know, the last part of this intro is meant to be, if you could go back and give yourself some advice, what would it be? And I kind of disagree with the premise a little bit, because I think the whole point of starting something is that you don't know. I think if I knew some of the things I know now, I probably would not have done, you know, we would not have done what we did. If you have to basically be naive to start a company, I think if your eyes are too wide open, you just wouldn't do it. It's too risky. It's too hard. But I will say that the time scale is probably longer than what I thought it was going to be back then. You know, we have all these models about how the company was going to grow and what was going to happen. And particularly when you're building a new brand, it just takes some time to get market awareness. So the time that it would take to kind of get to where we are is one thing I would say. But the main piece of advice I would have, and I'm biased because I have a co-founder, is to find a really good partner. Maybe it's a co-founder, maybe it's an early employee, but find somebody who, you know, if the spirit of that last piece of this question is kind of give yourself some advice, it would be find a really good partner, and somebody who has a complementary set of skills, but who has a really strong alignment in terms of vision, because I could not have done this without my business partner.
Great, thanks for that. Rochelle?
Hi, my name is Rochelle Alley. I graduated SOM in 2006. prior to SOM, I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton as a consultant. I worked for the city of Alexandria in Alexandria, Virginia, and I coached at a YMCA. And after SOM, I worked for about 8 or 9 years in nonprofit organizations in the child welfare and early education field before starting my company. My company is called Big Orange Splot, and it is a consulting organization that focuses on the child welfare and early education field. And why I did it was I got to a place, my company is really not that different from what I was doing before in many ways. I stayed in the same field and basically continued to do the things that I was best at, and was able to let go of the things that I didn't enjoy as much working in organizations in terms of paperwork and sort of daily staff management pieces. And I did it largely for work-life balance reasons, because I came to a place in my life where I really wanted to be working in the same way in the field and making a difference. But I also really needed to have more flexibility for my family. I'm trying to remember what else I'm supposed to say in the intro. Advice to myself is I would have done it a month earlier, but that's about it. I mean, I think kind of like was said before, you know, part of it is the journey, and I didn't do everything perfectly. You learn along the way, but I think that it's been an amazing experience, and I'm so happy that I did it. And I'm not a big person on regret, so I think it is sort of a journey, and not everything will be perfect, but not a lot of hindsight other than maybe making the jump a little earlier.
Great. So just kind of going back to starting with Dennis, and, you know, following up on some of the things that were talked about. Of course, one thing that, you know, we know about the industry that you're in is margins can be quite low. And you had a great connection with Whole Foods in terms of seeing how the market was reacting to these products, and you can almost get some kind of indirect testing that way to see, you know, what maybe segment is going to be more popular than another. How much did that connection with Whole Foods help in terms of, you know, seeing that firsthand? I know you said that you saw anecdotally these brands doing quite well, and also how did you leverage that connection with your employer in terms of, are they stocking your brand? Were they one of your first customers? Right. Things of that nature.
That's a really, really good question. But Tristan, I want to go back to something that John said about having a partner, because the same thing is true for me. I started Ocho primarily because I knew I could get into Whole Foods. And in fact, I had some bench tops or some prototype samples that I started giving away to parents at the school where my kids went to school, just saying, hey, would you pay $2 for this? And they were variations of different types of candy bars: peanut butter, coconut, caramel peanut, mocha. One of the guys that was most interested in the product had just graduated from Cal and started an online real estate company called Zip Realty, kind of a precursor to Zillow. I'm not a good CEO. I don't have the spreadsheet. I don't have an interest in the spreadsheets and the financials and the cap tables. But by the same token, I wouldn't allow my partner, who's also the CEO, to develop product or packaging or any kind of marketing. And we have a really deeply felt sense of respect for each other's skills. What we did is, when I started making, I had some prototypes made, and I went into the buyers at Whole Foods and I said, look, you guys, you know me. If I do that, I'd left Whole Foods by then. And I said, if I bring this to market, would you carry it? And they said, well, yeah, of course we would. So a few months later, came back with product in formal packaging. We were using a co-packer at the time. And they took it and put it in all the stores in the Bay Area Whole Foods. And then it went up to Seattle, and then it went down into LA, and then it started going into mainstream supermarket stores like Safeway. And with that, we knew that we were going to launch the company. But for me, having a partner that I can use as a sounding board and to complain about everything from the retailers who fail to execute to issues related to personnel in the factory, having someone to speak to about all of the issues has been critically important to me. One other thing, if I were to have given myself some advice, I would have done this sooner. I think Rochelle made a really important point around life, and John did too, life-work balance and the risk exposure. But I started working on Ocho long before I cut the cord from my other source of revenue, because it's just too risky in the CPG world.
Can I actually echo that and add one thing? I also feel like partners have been essential in my journey, and mentors as well. I think before I left and to launch and after, there have been some really key people, some of whom are SOM people actually. Elizabeth Sadlon, Shayna Katz, before I launched were advisors, and then afterwards just folks. And sometimes, they've been people who join my journey at all different points, but those key advisors and sounding boards are instrumental in keeping your company being its best.
Yeah, and I think there are two really critical points being drawn out here by all of you. One on the side of, having a partner broadly defined. It could be a co-founder, a first employee, or an initial employee, as John said, and that the path is usually lonely. And there's a lot of tension in terms of, which direction to follow, who to talk to, reconcile conflicting advice. And I think that one thing is important is to talk to a lot of people early and often. I think there's often this shroud of secrecy for people who are considering entrepreneurship. Everything has to be, quote unquote, in stealth mode, or everyone's looking to steal someone else's idea. But having these discussions early and often seem to be, a critical part of what I see from the founders I've worked with in terms of success. So I really appreciate kind of bringing out the idea of having advisors, having partners, and having these important discussions.
Can I say one small thing about that? The only word of caution that I would say, not from my experience, but actually my husband also is an entrepreneur who started something, is if you are leaving a place where there's potential overlap between the subject matter of what you're doing, or actually just in general, you have to make sure you are 110% above board about what your obligations are to your employer, and what you're doing and how you're spending your time when you're working on it. Because I think working prior to launch is crucial, but you also want to do it 100% above board. And I'm very thankful my husband was very careful about that, but he also had an employer who was somewhat vindictive. And so it was really good that he had done things above board. And so just to also be very thoughtful about making sure you're managing your exit 110% the right way.
Great. And Rochelle, that actually is a great segue to the next question I had, which was for you. It seems like, Dennis was, of course, working in a very similar space in terms of CPG. John obviously made more of a transition, but you identify your experience as being very similar to what you had previously done, just kind of on your own terms. And I was wondering, because it is a common question students ask is, how do I do it in a way that is above board? So can you discuss maybe for everyone some of the steps you took and how you think about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I just made sure that if I was supposed to be spending my time doing certain things, performing deliverables, having my time allocated to my current employer, I always honored that. But then I was working maybe at night or weekends to connect with people, to be sounding boards, to start thinking about things, or to just do the legal paperwork of starting to form something. And so I also just tried to maintain relationships as best I could with the various people who I've worked with. And I think that has been really instrumental. In fact, I mean, my first really good client was not the employer I left, but actually the employer before that was one of my earliest strong clients. And so I think a lot of it is just managing relationships well, and also just being true to whatever the agreements are, and obligations, and really what you signed up for your existing employer, to do that 100%. And so it means you're taking on more than 100% as a whole, but I think that's what I believe, and I think it's the right way to do it. But I'm curious what other people have done. I mean, not everybody approaches it that way. So
great. And before we keep going, just a reminder for everyone listening: if you have any questions, feel free to drop us a line in the Q&A box so we can get to those in a few minutes. John, for you, one thing that, I wondered when you were talking about your business is, of course, golf is a pretty niche market in terms of who you're looking for in terms of customers. There's a lot of discussion around, the game of golf more generally in the US, if it's accessible to the population at large, and just wondering how you think about that business in terms of when you're creating a new piece of apparel. Are you thinking about, the golfer that's golfing today, or are you thinking about, more of the burgeoning market of golfers and trying to get other people interested in it through your line of clothing?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge at the outset that what I'm doing is in a lot of ways pretty frivolous. We're creating, golf apparel for a very narrow segment of the population. So I completely acknowledge that, but it relates to a point I wanted to make earlier, which is, another kind of piece of advice is you had better be incredibly passionate about the thing that you're going to do, because the undertaking is so intense that without a passion that goes to the very core of who you are for the thing that you're trying to do, you will fail. You will give up. I think the passion component is so important, and whether that passion is something you're parlaying from that led you to the career you had before, and you're parlaying from that career into a continuation, hanging your own shingle, but doing a similar set of things, or that passion is something that you discover outside your existing career path. The passion has to be there. It's so fundamental. And we just had this passion for whatever reason for a very particular thing. It started out with the way golf shirt collars laid and the way they splayed out and didn't stand up proper the way a dress shirt collar might, and just wanting to fix that one tiny little problem. And from that passion came this whole brand, which golf is a niche. Niches are great places to start businesses because they're not seen as overly competitive. And so if you can create a brand within a niche, you can establish a brand within a niche, you can then use that strength to grow outside. And the other thing is niches aren't small. It depends on your capital structure, what the expectations of the business are. But if you have a narrow, or even better, founder held capital structure, then the pressure to get to some $100 million top line is not there. And you can build a great little business inside of a niche. And then, like I said, use that niche to grow beyond. So golf for us is the ultimate athleisure sport. Athleisure is kind of a buzzword in apparel these days, and it just kind of means clothing that has performance characteristics like moisture wicking and stretch, but that is appropriate in non-athletic environments. And if you think about the average golf polo, trends of men's dress are changing. My business partner likes to say the suit is dying. The sport coat is dying and the suit is dead. So people are just dressing differently these days, a little bit more relaxed. It aligns really nicely to the way people have been dressing on the golf course for a long time. All of which is just to say that the brand right now is heavily rooted in the game of golf, and most of our distribution is through golf shops at private country clubs and public golf resorts. But our broader vision is to use that customer base and to use that base of design experience to grow outside of golf and be a mainstream men's sort of quasi-luxury athleisure brand. But we're starting in what you could call AAA ball, which is these little golf shops. They're not the most professional retailers. They're not, gonna break you over a 10% discount on this or ship the product back if it doesn't sell, and a bunch of other ways. It's a really nice small pond to grow, and then take that from sort of that niche into the next phase of a broader market. But there's a lot that I said there, but
no,
I think niches are great places to build businesses, and keeping your capital structure right sized to the business that you have in mind is really important.
No, that's great. And you mentioned one thing that I wanted to bring up, which was, what is the impact of my venture, and how should that matter? One thing I often get from students is they'll come really excited about a question that, seems to be more trivial than something that is changing lives, versus other people come to you with this life, changing question, but you could tell they're not the person to answer it because they're just not passionate about it. And one thing I just wanted to state is this importance of passion, this importance of interest, just because, if someone is, putting on your shirt, eating your candy bar, getting advice from you, and they're excited about it, and you're changing something about them, even if it's just from, for a fleeting moment, that's a core part of what we try to do as entrepreneurs, is find that niche and try to, make someone's day a little better through a product or a service. So I think this idea of following your passion is a core one. And it's really what I always push people coming to me looking for advice is, just because it's a really good question or a really good problem, or it seems to be like you can make some revenue there, if you don't feel that passion to get up, and stay, like to Rochelle said, working on things on nights and on weekends, you're never going to get that done. So, thanks for bringing up that point of passion. And then a question for all of you is, when I get approached by individuals who are still in school or with no work experience, they often worry about, can I manage people? How are people going to take me seriously as a manager? What you have what you bring to the table, of course, is a wealth of experience in different industries, even if it's not the industry that you're currently in. How do you think that experience, either being on a team or managing people, managing processes, really was able to help you be more effective? And if each of you could, give a little snippet on that, some questions are coming in and we can start transitioning, but something that I really wanted to get your opinion on.
Is that directed at me?
It's all three
specifically?
of you. Yeah.
Well, I've been talking for a while, so someone else.
Yeah, we can start with, Rochelle, if you.
Dennis, you're smiling. Or Rochelle, sure.
I think that managing a team is also one of the most important and critical skills in an entrepreneurial setting. I think antecedent to that is building the team. And for Ocho, it's been critically important to get the right people. One moment, please.
Yeah.
The day in life of an entrepreneur.
I was saying this before. I'm gonna have to relocate in a moment, I think. But it's building the team, I think, is critically important. And that was my partner and CEO, Scott, who has extraordinary communication skills, and my general manager and the VP of sales and marketing. It's really important to make sure, for us anyway, that the communication is transparent, that everybody knows exactly what's going on at what time with what production schedule or with what retailer and what promotional thing is happening. And so we, managing the team is a function, I think, of really respecting each other's skill set, respecting your own weaknesses, and allowing that team to really solidify and reach a point where everybody can rely on one another. That said, I do want to point out one more thing about Ocho. I'm located in a very, very depressed neighborhood in West Oakland. And I was mentioning with Rochelle before the call began that there's an organization in LA called Homeboy Industries, which serves as a sort of an inspirational compass for me. I feel that my team on the floor, the factory floor, which is composed primarily of women from Guatemala and Central America and Thailand and Myanmar and Ethiopia, that team of people is critically important to me, not just because of the value and the benefit that they contribute to the brand itself, but also because they're invisible. In our society, this is a group of people who don't get much recognition. And I go out every day and greet them all in their native language and say hello and chat a little bit. That dignity and respect for the people who work in that invisible part of the company is really important, I think, not just for the longevity of the brand, but also for the integrity and the sense of community and participation that everybody has in the company.
Great, thank you. Rochelle, can you talk a little bit about how you see your work experience, not from a phenomenological perspective of doing something similar, but just the managing experience you received and working on a team, how you've leveraged that as a founder?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that was beautiful, and you said that incredibly well. I think vision is really important and sharing the passion. But I also think this is an area where I would say, you don't have to rush. I know I said my thing I'd change is I'd start a month early, but only a month earlier. There's a lot of people who start organizations right out of grad school, and I'm very thankful I didn't, because unless your product is if there's a time sensitive market where you're trying to go to market with something that's really innovative, then yes, jump in there. But there's also a lot to be said for just working in the industry and getting experience, and get experience managing before you go off and launch it as your own venture. Because to me, I mean, I managed folks, and sometimes I failed, sometimes it didn't go the way I wanted it. And I think that was a really good learning experience to have before then launching my own thing, because it then informed how I approached relationships and getting people all on the same page and moving people forward collectively afterward. And so I think, and also having worked for many years after grad school before doing it gave me a lot of relationships and a lot of knowledge about the industry and a lot of street cred, if you will, that I knew what I was talking about. And you know what I mean? So I think there's also a benefit to making sure you have all the experience that's going to make you feel confident starting out and set you off on the right foot before you do your own venture, and not feel like you have to rush it too. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Great. No, thanks for that. And before we move over to the Q&A, we have some great questions for the panelists. And again, as a reminder, if you have anything on your mind, feel free to ask using the submit button. I always like opening it up to the panelists themselves. Is there anything that, in hearing the experience of your colleagues here, that you thought that you wanted to ask them? Of course, no pressure to do so, but I kind of want to give a moment as we start gathering up all these questions, in case you had something that you wanted to highlight that they said, or in case you had a question for them more generally.
John, I was listening to what we've been talking about today. I can't turn my imagination off for different types of sports or different channels of trade that you'd want to pursue. Is it a function of capitalization or finding the design team? When you think about that, first of all, how do you resist just diving in, over your head? And then B, how do you plan your strategy for the next wave of products?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think being specific is really important. I think entrepreneurial people tend to have a lot of ideas and want to go in a lot of different directions, and oftentimes they need to be kind of wrangled back into a more focused path. And I would say that could certainly be the case with what we're doing. There's no limit of products that we want to develop, markets that we'd like to attack, but we realize that I'll go back. I think that the way we decided to do what we're doing from a capital structure perspective, which is to maintain as much ownership as we possibly could and not raise $1 billion and put these huge investor expectations on ourselves, but rather have a company that grows on its own merits by its own revenues and grows maybe at a slightly slower rate, but achieving profitability more quickly, et cetera, et cetera. That one decision to have the capital structure be set up to maximize the principal's ownership in the business basically influences everything, because we have an immediate and very specific constraint, capital. And that constraint forces the discipline of choice and specific choice as far as which markets we attack and which products we make. So the golf is the most specific market and most niche, and within that we're focused on kind of the top 10% of golf facilities. So right there, our distribution is defined, it is knowable, and it is very specific for the midterm, let's say near to midterm. Once that is defined, you think, well, what are the products that can be most productive within that market? Because we can't develop everything. Product development is incredibly time consuming and capital intensive. So because we don't have all this money to go and splash, we have to be very focused about the decisions we make on which products to develop. So we think about which are the most productive categories and we attack those, where we can differentiate and we attack those. We are constrained in terms of the time. We're a small team, and so we can only do so much in a given day. everybody here is maxed to 125%. So I would say that has been a really good thing, I think. But if I take a step back, it all flows from a decision that we made about how we were going to capitalize our business. So we have some investors, but we raised, a lot of the typical startup mantra is, it's cool how much money you can raise. And I think the opposite. I think it's cool how little money you can raise, what you can do, raising as little as possible. So, a lot of the discipline is just strictly coming from that one decision.
Great. Thanks, John. Anything else from the panelists before we move on to the audience? All right. So, first thing I'll mention is, because I'll skip over it when I go over the questions, everyone who's asked questions so far is very thankful for all of you for being here, and so are we. So thanks again for sharing your candid experiences. We all really appreciate that. All the questions so far are pretty general, so anyone, please feel free to kind of jump in, and more than one response is great. So we'll go with the first question, which relates to a lot of what was said earlier about finding the time to work on this while still being employed nights and weekends. And the question is, how do you find the motivation and energy to continue when you're not making as much progress as you like to, maybe feeling a little burnt out from your other priorities, your job, your expectations, et cetera?
I'll jump in real quick. Speaking from personal experience, my career before launching Holders and Born just wasn't quite filling the glass. I wasn't totally satisfied, at the end of the day with what I'd done to, fulfill my potential or what I wanted to do. So I was motivated by the desire to create something that I felt like I could pour my whole self into. And so there was no limit to the extra energy resources I could find with that idea in mind. So, and I think also it was a full-time, well-paying job, but it just wasn't, I had the time, basically. I had the time and the emotional energy at the end of the day to go and, do something else. I think if I had been totally satisfied and just absolutely maxed out, probably I wouldn't have had the time or the need to do what I did. But from my situation, part of the motivation to do it was that I didn't feel totally satisfied or fulfilled in what I was doing previously.
Great.
Yeah, I would say similarly, I was ready to move on. And so I was really motivated, and I knew that I needed to make this jump to this because I really needed in my life a different type of work-life balance, and the flexibility to be working on my time. And so I think I was really motivated, and I really believe in what I do. I love working in the child well-being systems change world. So it's a true passion. And even now, there are days where it's incredibly frustrating. You have to do a ton of politics, and any job is going to be a ton of work if you really believe in it. And so it's part of it is just passion and motivation. And I guess the only other thing I would say is, if you're finding yourself in that situation, then it is a good question of is there a way to set yourself up to be able to leave where you're at and truly jump in? Or are you feeling like maybe you want to just redouble down on where you're at and put it aside? Because I think part of it is really thinking about what type of risk can you take on? Do you have enough savings that you can jump into something, give yourself a certain amount of time to say, I'm going to go full steam. I'm going to leave where I am and go full steam on this for a certain amount of time and see how far I can take it and see if I can launch and be successful. Kind of just really looking at your real situation about your financials and your whatever, if you're in a relationship with someone else, what your collective financial and risk tolerance is for jumping in full steam, because there are only so many hours in the day, and it's really tough when you're trying to manage your obligations where you are and something that you're trying to build for the future. So I guess those are some things that come to mind as you ask that question.
Great. No, thank you for that.
And I think also that both John and Rochelle have referred to the passion. For me, it was also a function of imagination. So I had left Whole Foods and started another company prior to Ocho, and I used that company to create another line of organic products for Safeway called O Organic. And in my case, it was, look, I've created two really strong brands for other parties, and I really wanted to do one for myself. And I've talked to people who write books, and they talk about this desire to create a book, to write a book. For me, it was an exercise of the need to express my own imagination and to do something creative within the CPG world. I also wanted to share a story, which I'm sure Rochelle and John are going to appreciate. I was talking to a guy last week on Friday who makes French puddings here in the Bay Area. He's really successful and not profitable. And he came over and he's looking at my factory, and we were talking. And he started to open up a little bit. And I said, oh, so you're at that point where you wake up at 3 a.m. thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And he said, Dennis, this has happened to me twice this week. I said, yeah, well, I know exactly how you feel. But I think those moments are going to come irrespective of what you do. But there's this energy that comes from the passion, the imagination, and the thrill of it all. And that serves, I think, all three of us pretty well.
Great, thank you. That is a good story, and I'm sure, like you said, the other two of you can sympathize with that greatly. So, merging a couple of other questions, I think this is an important concept more generally. You know, one thing that's being asked relates to the support network, and we all know how important support networks are, not just for entrepreneurship, but for most events in life. You know, and one of the questions relates to the fact that, you know, some people have expectations in your network in terms of what you should be doing, maybe after graduating from a graduate program, or more generally, which is working for a corporation, doing what the modal person does. Did any of you deal with that friction in terms of people in your network, not necessarily not supporting you, but just thinking about the fact that maybe you were making a mistake, and how did you reconcile that? How did you deal with that?
So I didn't, but I will tell a story that my husband experienced, which is we went to dinner with an old friend right as he was launching, and he launched his business in like the worst part of the downturn of the economy. And the person just basically looked at him when he explained what he was doing and was like, are you sure you want to do that? Like, I think that's a terrible idea. And I think part of it is like, you have to know who you are and just, think it through and think through the realistic risks and benefits and dynamics and make the right choice that you believe in. Hopefully it's a success, and maybe it's a failure you learn from, but I think part of it is just really, you think it through and you make the decision that you really believe in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And what Rochelle is saying, and my nuanced kind of addition to that is that you have to know who you are. I mean, I think there were a lot of people in my family who thought I was nuts. My friends, they care a little bit less about what your professional success is. They were supportive. They were early buyers of our crappy first shirt. But you have to know who you are, but also who you are is going to become what you do in a way that's much deeper when you start a company than when you're an employee of a company, because you're manifesting it every day, your company and yourself. And so those things, they're dynamic and they're evolving. But at the outset, you have to have a notion of yourself as an entrepreneur. You have to have, and it's aspirational. We're all creating ourselves as entrepreneurs every day, and we're never really done with that. But you have to have this feeling in your bones that your fullest and highest and best use is as somebody who starts a business, whatever that business is doing, and a business that will grow and create jobs. We have a warehouse, similar to what Dennis was saying, and some of my most fulfilling moments are seeing our warehouse team and knowing that when our business succeeds and we can give additional overtime hours, hourly workers do not turn down extra work. It's a funny difference between office workers and hourly workers, the attitude about work. But anyway, you have to have a self-sense, a self-conception as an entrepreneur. That needs to resonate, because if you don't, then you should just work at a company. You should just sort of tie your personality and sense of self to the artifice that company has already built. A lot of people do that. You go work for fill in the blank, Goldman Sachs, and you're a Goldman Sachs guy and all, gal, and that's all, that becomes part of your identity. But if you're willing to forge your own identity with your own brand or with your own company, that's going to, whether you are that or whether you have that or not, but you had better have it to be successful, because along with the passion, and they're interrelated, that's what's going to keep you going, is this sense that this is your destiny. So that is rambling, to say the least.
No, that's helpful.
That's my response.
And this point of identity brings us to another question from the audience, which is, most of you have been doing this for a few years now. Do you still feel like a founder, or do you feel more now as an executive, as a leader of the firm? And, how do you differentiate those if you do feel a little different about what your day-to-day is like?
My role as founder has changed dramatically, because when we first started the company, I had the most experience in the retail CPG space. And as the company has matured and we've taken on a different type of manufacturing, for example, we manufacture everything ourselves, but for a while we had a co-packer. And then we were also making everything by hand until 2016. My role, I think now, is to recess from the operational aspect of the company. I still am the founder, and people like to talk to the founder for one reason or another. But, my CEO is much better at running the company. My general manager is all about scheduling and making equipment purchasing. My VP of sales and marketing is better than me. And I look around at the table and I think it's time for me to recess. I will say that at this point, I'm trying to bake into the DNA of the company, apart from the fact that we feel we make the best confection, period, and that it's organic. But I'm also trying to bake into the company certain values pertaining to how we recognize and respect the dignity of individuals, and how we, as we're located in a rough neighborhood, ask the question, how can we promote the common good? So these are sort of, they're important issues that need to be integrated into the company from the earliest days. And I think as founder, that's where I'm focusing more of my energy.
Got it.
I also, similar, a little different. I just never even think about the fact that I'm a founder or the fact that I'm a CEO. Like, it's not something that I think about. Because to me, my role and my job is about being a support for systems change for the benefit of kids and families and parents. And so what I think about is, how am I showing up to that role as a support to the other people who are driving forward systems change for kids? Like, how am I working to support what other people are doing? How am I being true to what I believe is really right, and speaking up when it's appropriate, and listening when maybe I need to learn more? And how am I bringing the skills that I have, my portfolio, forward toward that vision and goal? And so, I don't know, I just don't even think about the role piece as much as, how am I trying to use what I've got to move forward what we're all trying to work toward.
Great. And then John, a question came in that I think is that's an interesting one to touch upon. You're the only panelist who didn't go into the industry that you were in, broadly defined. How do you think the on-the-job skills you had learned between SOM and your venture were helpful? Or do you think, looking back on it, you could have jumped right from SOM to your venture without having that experience in between?
Sure. Well, a lot of the other newer golf brands were started by people who worked at Polo Ralph Lauren for 10 years before starting either an eponymous label or under another name. And so that was their version of grad school. They didn't go get an MBA. They went and worked for Ralph Lauren for 10 years, and they had all the sourcing background and all the market understanding that we lacked. So that is definitely a more traditional route. With that being said, I think that sometimes being a little naive about an industry can be a benefit, in that you don't know the rules, so you're not afraid to break them. And that sounds very trite, but I think it's true. There were just certain things that we weren't afraid to do with our fit and with our manufacturing techniques, asking, our manufacturing partners to do certain things that just, they said no so many times, and we just kept saying, no, yeah, we can figure this out. We can figure this out. We can figure this out. And I think what we got, talking about the polo shirt collar, was something that was markedly different. I mean, it is superior to the competition in the market, and you have to have something different and hopefully superior to deserve to exist in crowded marketplace. So I think sometimes it can almost be helpful. With that being said, as it relates to using all my various other experiences, and I had a diverse kind of range of career experiences leading into this, I think I reflect on this all the time. This is the only role that would have really used all of the things that I did. So the graphic design, I helped design our emails and our catalogs and our lookbooks. I use all those skills. I wasn't using them in my post MBA career until this moment. So I'm using all of my Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop and InDesign skills from pre-SOM. That's one hat that I wear. Another hat that I wear is I'm building financial models and forecasting our inventory demand and doing a bunch of things using Excel like I did at the private equity job that I worked at. So I use that all the time. I'm using little bits and pieces of everything that I did before in this role in a way that no other, I think, single role that would have been more specific and siloed within a larger corporation would have allowed me. So it's the most fulfilling thing, because I feel like everything I did pre-SOM, it wasn't a waste. It's all coming together here in a way that, for me, is really satisfying and beautiful. I mean, there were times post-SOM before starting this company that I just felt like, well, the first 6 years of my career, those happened, and but now I feel like I'm using it all, and it's great.
Great. So we're going to get to our last question here, which kind of ties into SOM more generally. People are wondering out there what you were able to leverage in terms of resources and skills that you learned while at SOM, and how that's helped you since becoming a founder. And an open floor question. We can start with maybe Dennis or Rochelle, since John just gave a great answer to the last question. But John, feel free to jump in too if there's anything you kind of want to highlight. Of course, I know, John, you met your co-founder here, so you're a little biased in terms of the direct connection. But if there's anything else that you would all highlight, that'd be great.
I John, you mentioned you didn't know Excel. One of my classmates from SOM asked me 10 years after we graduated what was the most important thing I learned at SOM, and I said Excel, right? How to do a spreadsheet. I think, first of all, one of the great benefits that SOM gave me was confidence. And then as it pertains to fundraising and interaction with the community at large, is some credibility. There were, I don't remember anything from accounting and finance. I'm sorry to say that. But I remember that one of the OB classes, organizational behavior classes I took, talked about change and change management. And as the company grows, it goes through various iterations of change. And I draw on some of those books and some of that stuff, because change is resisted no matter what. And if the company is going to stay vital, it's going to have to grow. And in order to grow, you need to break out of your existing framework for how you're doing things. So change management has been one of the issues that has been really helpful. And it was like a key topic for me at SOM.
Great.
Yeah, I think the organizational behavior stuff, just looking at the interrelationship between informal, formal, and cultural resource aspects of an organization, and how misalignment or alignment helps or hinders folks moving forward. Some of the leadership work that we did, and certainly some of the relationships just with my peers, as well as some mentors that I found through and supports through the alumni network of connecting with other SOMers. And then the other thing I would say is marketing. Just the perspective of how to think about marketing, customer perspective and the importance of that. I work in a field where there's a lot of smart people, but not with backgrounds in marketing. And so sometimes what's really intuitive when you go through, after you go through an MBA program, is not the way people operate. And so I think that's been something that has been helpful, and I've been able to carry forward and share with the folks that I work with in my field, so that we can be more effective. So I would say all of those things.
Great.
Yeah, and Tristan, you alluded to it, but the best thing I got out of SOM is meeting my business partner and co-founder. He met his wife there, so I'm not the best thing that he got out of the school, but I'm fine with that inequity. But for me, coming from a non-finance, sort of atypical MBA background, there were so many just little blocking and tackling things that I learned, and I really dove into while at SOM. You know, I was doing all of the like weekend train the street and this and that just to catch up, it felt like. So all that is so fundamental, those building blocks, just the basics that you need. And then I would say the ability to think about industries and markets and companies and break things down into their smaller pieces and sort of just understand structure. You know, all that. I don't remember what specific classes, but it was incredibly helpful. But then the last piece, I think, is what Dennis said, which is the credibility that it gives you. You know, people are going to take a meeting with a Yale SOM alum that they might not take with some average person off the street. And so just being able to lean on that a little bit, both in the terms of the direct network that Yale offers, but also the indirect benefit that you get from the association.
Great, thank you so much. And you know, there are more questions. That's what happens. You have an engaging panel that we can't get to. So apologies to those in attendance who had some great questions that we couldn't get to. I just want to thank our panelists, because I know if everyone listening got half of what I got out of this, everyone's going to be pretty happy. Thank you for your candid feedback. Thank you for building off one another and bringing up some core concepts about the journey that's not always easy. So we appreciate all of that. And with that said, thank you for all those who are listening, and we look forward to the next episode.